So the first video was on reinterpreting biblical passages in the book of Genesis to include the possibility of Islam. And I recently ran into an article, a book review actually, of books that have come out within the past 10 years. And this economics book described that Islam is actually at the economic core of Western civilization. And I haven't read the book yet, but I thought that was amusing in light that this lecture, I was toying with the title of calling it Wall-E, the movie by Disney, and the refutation of capitalism and the basis for an alternative economic system. But meanwhile, an economics book kind of was mirroring my thesis that Islam is really at the core of scripture, and at the same time, economically, Islam is at the core of Western Judeo-Christian civilization, if you will. And then my second video was reinterpreting Islam for Muslims, in that you shouldn't look at people who call themselves puritanical and fundamentalists and just assume that they have a monopoly on truth of the religion. And in fact, true religion, when you look at it from any angle, whether you're a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim, requires you to be your own authority on scripture at the end of the day, and also on theology, which is a tall order. But more pertinent to our task at hand is the critique of capitalism. And I remember when I was younger, I was a dogmatic Republican, and I hated protesters very much. And I asked an older, my mom's friend's son, who's an older kid, so I must have been about 14, he was probably about 20, and I asked him, are you a Democrat or Republican? And he took me into the next room, away from the adults, and he said, why would you ask me such a thing? So basically I was trying to convince him to become a Republican, and I subscribe to free market economics. So I told him, what's the alternative when you look at social and political norms? I guess I was socially conservative, or just culturally conservative at the time. And I asked him what was the refutation of capitalism, and he told me it's your job to disprove capitalism. And it stuck in the back of my mind, even though he would tell me that I had lost that argument. And I have to thank him because he set in motion in my mind a lot of themes which I've discussed so far in my videos, including the verse in the Quran that I interpreted, and hopefully I'll come out with a complete commentary on the entire chapter, God willing. But I never thought I would be doing this. But here is my critique of capitalism. And the first thing we can start with is how industrial farming works, but I'll take a concrete example. So before the economic collapse in 2008, purebred Spanish horses were a very hot commodity, and they had bred hundreds of thousands of these horses, and now, after the collapse, they were preparing to cull, which is kill en masse. We use a polite word for it. And farmers who own the horses have culled tens of thousands of horses with no end in sight. And this is an imbalance created by capitalism. And one can argue it's okay if you do it with tulips or Bitcoin or cattle futures or insurance or some paper commodity. But when you do it to living creatures, then all of a sudden you've decided that you don't want to take care of these animals anymore. I mean, you created them, you bred them by the hundreds of thousands, assuming that there would be a buyer. So that's immense suffering. And it's not against the law. There's not any law against such a act, but then it's implicit then, right, in capitalism that there's materialism, and materialism that animals don't have rights because they're not human. So but let's broaden that on a wider basis, and we'll expand into it later how it affects the entire United States. But industrial farming is used to grow most of our food, and pigs and cows and horses and chickens are forced into crowded conditions, and they have their beaks cut off and such to feed the 300 million people of this country, and that lifestyle is expanding to the whole world. And like I mentioned in my prior video, that the world couldn't sustain this kind of consumption, not the least because one package of McDonald's has like 5 pieces of garbage, so that itself creates such a toxic environment. But the way you slaughter these creatures, the way you keep them, it's kind of a necessity among capitalism to allow cheap meat be available to the masses. And back in the day, meat was more expensive, and perhaps we should ethically move to a more humane form of slaughter, one that doesn't involve brutally treating animals. And meat might cost a bit more, but capitalism would not allow that. So capitalism really, I feel, a theme of it is to exhume nature, to suck everything out of it. And a good example of that is also palm oil from Indonesia. And I saw a good video of it on YouTube where basically everything, cosmetics and shampoos and soaps, uses palm oil, and that's made on plantations in Indonesia. and it's used in hundreds, if not thousands, of consumer products. And we are literally destroying one of the rarest ecosystems with multiple endangered species in that. And not to mention the destruction of nature across the world. And my best friend always points out that we've lost more than half the rainforest. And if that's true, then you can just say that it's too late then for the Earth, almost, unless we're going to reverse that trend very quickly. And I feel like the film Wall-E, and of course that's a great film for many reasons, but the main theme of that film is that we completely trash the planet and then we leave. And one of the things the space company does in the movie is that they say that we're just going to wait for robots to clean up the earth and then we'll come back. But the secret plan is that we're just never going to come back. We're just going to abandon the earth. And it's cheaper and just as good to live on a spaceship with floating chairs and TV. But I feel like that film is really a warning. It's a warning for multiple reasons. And Jared Diamond is a very famous anthropologist, and he wrote the book Guns, Germs, and Steel. And you should, of course, read the book because it's one of the most famous books of the past 20 years. But on top of that, it's been made into a really digestible National Geographic documentary that I believe was on Netflix, but it's been taken down. So you may be able to find it on other sources. But he wrote another book called Collapse, and it's about why civilizations collapse. And he's such a respected anthropologist, everybody listens to him on why the West rose as a civilization, or why, let's say, Europe and Asia are powerful continents to be able to take over North America, whereas South America and, let's say, the Australian Aborigines lagged behind technologically. So he wrote a wonderful book explaining from historical terms 3 inventions: guns, germs, and steel. But he wrote another book that people should also read called Collapse. And again, it's about why civilizations collapse. And the thesis of the book is that ecological conditions from the rise of civilization cause civilization to collapse. So basically, the environment can't sustain so many people once people start living a certain way. And I remember reading that 1 million people used to live in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. And imagine before modern plumbing how that was handled. If everybody just went in the river, then you would have a pretty toxic river after a certain point. Ironically, though, in another book that I read about jaguars, which you should definitely read because this guy's another wonderful naturalist who created the world's first tiger reserve in Indonesia, Sumatra to be specific. And he created the world's first jaguar reserve in Costa Rica, as well as a jaguar corridor between a dozen Latin American countries, which allow safe passage for the jaguar's migration route throughout the entire Mesoamerica. But in the book, ironically, they describe that when the conquest of Columbus came and it destroyed the native populations for, the reasons of disease and war and such, ironically, it was good for the wildlife, and the jaguar population and the rainforest really exploded. And you even had multiple Mayan cities and Aztec cities recede into the jungle. And so that was really good for the environment, ironically. So for several hundred years, until modern times, the turn of the century, of the 20th century, you actually had a flourishing rainforest and jaguar population. And we've even shown that the range of the jaguar is up to the southwest United States. They've been shown to cross the border, but they don't breed in Arizona and such. But it's quite remarkable. So ironically, civilizational collapse restores nature, because even despite that we stereotype indigenous cultures as being friendly with nature, they often use slash and burn farming to destroy large sections of the forest and then grow there, which would not be a sustainable way to keep the soil and its nutrients at all. So civilizations cause collapse when they're not in harmony with their ecosystem, and he means it almost as a warning. And I just want to add then, there's a theme in the Quran of the civilizations that were destroyed before. The people of Ad and Thamud, people of Noah and such. And it's probably a reference to the Nabateans and such, but it just points out that they were great cities, capitals of trade, and they just vanished. People just walk in their ruins and they just wonder, oh, how must it have been, or how foolish were they, or how did they die, and why did they disappear without a trace? In some ways their language is obscure also. So the same fate may befall us. So I guess the moral would be, although Jared Diamond is an anthropologist who doesn't take a stance on religion ever, is that they agree with the Quranic thesis that God can destroy your civilization at any time. There's no reason to assume just because you're powerful. But anyway, my first critique of capitalism would be where I recommended Ayn Rand to a friend, Atlas Shrugged, and it was an important part of my early young adulthood as well. But for Ayn Rand, her theory is that wealth comes from adding value to raw minerals. So if you chop down a tree and then you make it into a table, you spent several hundred hours on work to craft it into a usable piece for a person. So you should be paid $100 for turning that tree into a table. But my theory adapts on this. When you zoom out, actually, wealth comes from the exploitation of nature, whether it's plants or animals or your fellow people. And to start with, the most concrete example was the animals. Anybody can take several hundred cows and auction them off for a good price. Several hundred goats and several hundred pigs and several hundred sheep. Make it several thousand, and you'll have a buyer in McDonald's, and you'll be very lucrative. And you don't have to worry about how the animals are killed. So if you want to do that, and I don't know, I don't want to judge anyone, but it's kind of a sleazy way to get rich. But another aspect to focus on would be the American sociologist C. Wright Mills. And he wrote a book called The Power Elite, and I had to write a summary of his ideas once. And I was helping somebody write a paper, and I was very upset that I had to spend my time, but it was actually a really good piece of reading. One of the best in my life. So his thesis, this American sociologist Mills, is that we now live in a mass society. So his thesis is that since the 20th century, ever-increasing consolidation of power in social, political, economic, military realms renders the individual powerless, and we are a mere cog in a machine. Now, I'll reference this at the end with a quote by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but I feel like everybody would agree that the kind of society in which we live is that individual people really don't have a chance to overcome institutions or to try to make institutions follow something reasonable or something that would be good to all. It would be very hard to petition your local institutions or your state or national institutions to effect a change that directly affects you, if not near impossible. Or either way, you're just a very small cog in a very big machine. And he calls this a mass society. Other people have also used this term also. And I feel like this is a far more accurate description of our society than simply saying that, well, we live in a free market economy. There are institutions, corporate especially, but also government and military and private, that are just looming towers. And when we say power consolidated, we also mean that wealth consolidated in a way so that you have a concentration of capital also in this mass society. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. A quick Wikipedia review of Mill's ideas shows that he believes that these people are the power elite specifically, and I feel like it makes sense. So it's the Metropolitan 400. So these are people who are the inherited social elites. They're found in the social register in major cities. And then you have celebrities, CEOs, corporate shareholders, captains of industry, major landowners. And then finally you have what he calls warlords, which are senior military, specifically the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And by the way, I read somewhere that there are 100 and something golf courses across the world for U.S. generals. So U.S. generals are very powerful people indeed. And then finally, there's the political directorate, which is 50 people in the executive branch, and the senior leadership of the Democratic and Republican parties, and professional government bureaucrats. So again, this is a far more accurate way to describe our society in which we live, rather than simply calling it a free market. Let's not delude ourselves. And part of the critique of a mass society is that prosperity and bureaucracy have weakened social ties. And I actually love film noir, and I didn't mean to bring this up, but Wall-E is actually a film noir film, and I may have to discuss that another time. And it's hard to identify a film, whether it's film noir or not. But a common theme in any film which showcases the ills of modern society is the isolation. Even though you're living in a large city, you're constantly in isolation and you're detached. So sociologists just understand that that's an effect of people living in a mass society. And finally, it says here that that there's also mass persuasion in such a society, which is propaganda. And then that led me to the whole common critique of advertising and consumer culture. So right now we have an obesity epidemic in the United States, and then we also have large amounts of depression and unhappiness and suicide. And so I would just say that this advertising causes you to consume and just buy. And the lie is that if you just buy something, you'll be happy. They show everybody smiling in the ad after they buy the product. They show everybody in the family happy. They show like your life has changed upside down. And every product claims this. So they're selling happiness. They're not really selling the product. And when you buy it, it makes you happy for like a day. day, and then after that it goes away. So this is due to a loss of spiritual culture and tradition and community and communalism and literacy. These were all things that people found joy in and satisfaction in the real world, and now we find satisfaction in simply buying things rather than forming bonds with the people around us. And this is a direct result of consumer culture and advertising. Not to mention low culture. Crude things are marketed to everybody, and that's just the lowest common denominator. Not to mention music is unreal. You have a complete collapse of taste in pop culture. The instruments are no longer real. The singers are no longer real. There's auto-tune, and then there's keyboard synthesizers. So it may sound like a trumpet is not a trumpet. It's somebody jamming on a keyboard, and then the singers are auto-tuned, and then even the lyrics are just meaningless. Whereas I remember music in the 50s, even the backup singers were phenomenal, and the musicians as well. But that was just the backup, so the lead person was, of course, fantastic. But we don't have anything a fraction of that today. But there's a lot of dangers to consumer culture, and not to mention the fact that sex is just the lowest common denominator means that there's a marketing of sexual culture, and then it's very unrealistic. Everybody's expectation of their bodies, if everybody on the cover of a magazine has perfect skin and a beautiful body, and then everybody walking around doesn't have that. So it just destroys your own self-image, it destroys other people's self-image, it leads to all kinds of anorexias and bulimias and disorders. But perhaps the worst lie that I've run into about and the cause of advertising and consumer society is sugar. I've been watching a doctor at the University of San Diego speak about how the sugar companies conspire to blame fat as the cause of obesity and diabetes, whereas sugar is really the driving cause of most of these things. And in fact, when they make something low fat, they put sugar in it to make it taste better. So you have continuing obesity and continuing diabetes.
So this is what we're dealing with. We are dealing with an industry that wants us to consume its product. Well, gee, every industry wants us to consume their product in some fashion or another. The question is, what if it hurts you? What if it hurts you? How about this one? The birth of the Uncola. Why we have the youngest customers in the business from 7-Up. You okay with that? But this is what, this was going on. How about this one? This was in Publix, supermarket chain in Florida, just a year ago. This is dietary sugar intake and cardiovascular health. I was a co-author of this and very proud to have been so. And we recommend a reduction in sugar consumption from 22 teaspoons of added sugar per day down to either 9 for males or 6 for females. That's a reduction by 2/3 to 3/4. How are we going to do that? How are we going to ever accomplish that? Especially since we don't even know we're consuming it. Because only 1/3 of our total added sugar intake comes from sugar-sweetened beverages like soda, juice, sports drinks. 1/6 comes from things that we call desserts, candy, ice cream, things like that. That means 1/2 of our sugar consumption is hidden in foods that we didn't even know had sugar, like salad dressing. Yogurt is a big one. Anybody here think yogurt is healthy? I got a bridge to sell you. Plain yogurt, sure. You want to take some whole fruit and mix it in with plain yogurt like they do in Europe? No problem. Off you go, okay? But processed yogurt, the stuff they're selling on the shelves in the supermarket, take a look. Just take a look at the amount of sugar. Now, it's total sugar, so some of it's lactose, which is milk sugar. The question is, how much of it is lactose and how much of it is added sugar? You can't know. You're not allowed to know, because the food industry won't let you know. Because in 1989, the food industry lobbied the Food and Drug Administration when they were coming out with the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act of 1990, and they said, if we told our consumers, our customers, how much added sugar we put in each of our processed foods, our competitors could duplicate our recipes. This is proprietary information, and you're not allowed to know it. And you know what the FDA said? Oh, okay, sure. Okay, this just shows. Okay, here's what you need to know. Of the 600,000 items in the American grocery store today, 80% of them are spiked with added sugar. And that's not for our purposes, that's for the industries, because they know when they add it, you buy more, for all the reasons that we've just discussed. And worse yet, there are 56 names for sugar, and you don't know them, and you're not allowed to know them. So, does anybody know what Florida crystals are? Sugar. Anybody know what evaporated cane juice is? If you evaporate cane juice, what do you get? You get sugar. Okay? And so that's what they use in yogurt because, oh, cane juice must be healthy, right? Oh, cane juice from cane, right? So here's how your food dollars have been bastardized and reallocated for you. Meats, this is 1982, 30 years ago, here's 2012. Meats down 10% because of the low-fat directive. Fruits and vegetables, the same. So everybody says, eat your fruits and vegetables. You know what? We're eating just as much as we were before. Grains and baked goods, 13 to 14%. Everybody says it's all the carbohydrate. Well, it's only up a little bit. Dairy products, 13 down to 10% because now everyone's lactose intolerant. Processed foods and sweets, 11.6, 22.9, a doubling in 30 years. That's what's happened. That's the change, and that's what we're talking about tonight. Because processed food is high sugar, low fiber, and real food is low sugar, high fiber. And every diet that works is low sugar, high fiber, because every diet that works is real food. That's what this is about. This is a processed food disaster. But the food industry is making money off it. In fact, lots of it. Because here's the S&P 500 over the last 5 years. Okay, here's the economic downturn of 2008 right here. And here's the stock price of McDonald's, Coke, and Pepsi. They're doing very well, thank you. And here's General Mills, Hormel, ConAgra, Kraft, Procter & Gamble, Archer Daniels, Midland. I said Hormel, I think, already. Bottom line, they're all doing better than the S&P. Want to make money? Invest in a food company. Because they have a winning formula for getting you to eat. But we don't get it. Well, this is a public safety issue because we will have no Medicare. Can we afford to wait? The food industry will say, we need more research. We need more research. Of course they're going to say we need more research. It's moving the goalpost. Can we afford to wait to enact these public health measures when healthcare will be bankrupt due to chronic metabolic disease in just 13 short years? That's your homework assignment. So, this is my second to last slide. This is a paper that just came out in Lancet in March. Profits and Pandemics, Prevention of Harmful Effects of Tobacco, Alcohol, and Ultra-Processed Food and Drink Industries. And what it says is that what we used to practice was called the old medicine, and we focused on infections as the problem and microbes as the vectors. And now the new medicine is all about chronic disease, and the vector has changed. It is now multinational corporations instead. That's who we're battling. So for further reading, I refer you to a whole bunch of academic articles. Fat Chance, which was written for the public, but really, to be honest with you, I wrote it for doctors. My publisher says, you cannot write a book for doctors, we won't publish it. I said, okay, fine, I'll write it for the public. But I really wrote it for doctors because the whole medical profession has to change. And the problem is, they bought the bill of goods that the food industry was selling, and we got to fix it, because a calorie is not a calorie. It never was and never will be.
So really, a little bit of subcutaneous fat isn't that bad, but sugar is just like pure alcohol to your liver, and it's the biggest cause of fatty liver disease after alcohol cirrhosis. So sugar is actually very deadly, and yet it's a secret ingredient in hundreds and thousands of food items, and so that's only done in the name of profit and advertising, and everybody's teeth are rotting. So I should add that Marx predicted that the workers of the world would unite and have a revolution. And yet we find who did have a revolution were the peasants. So that's in France in 1793 and in Russia in 1917. So the workers actually did not unite. They formed unions and then they became co-opted by capitalism. So, quote, bread and butter policies led to workers becoming complicit with capitalism. And now we see something that, since they've totally smashed the unions, states like North Carolina only have a 3% unionized rate in their workforce. So since unions don't matter anymore, there's literally nobody to stand in the way of trampling workers' rights. But I'll give you a good example of that. And I just saw this article, and it would break any normal person's heart, where people were laid off from a McDonnell Douglas plant, which made fighter planes. And it was bought by Boeing, which to this day still makes fighter planes. And all those people who were laid off, the major newspaper followed them, and it found that they were 70 years old or more, and they were working at Walmart, and they had never found jobs that adequately paid, and they never recovered, and they never received their full pension because the company fired them just before they would receive a nice pension, and therefore they had virtually no pension. And then they were working at Walmart. And so when you look at that, and when you look at how there are textile mills in South Carolina and there are steel mills in Ohio, which are no longer working, that kind of devastation is what caused Trump to win the election in 2016. And the Republican Party is entirely behind this lie, and so are mainstream economists, of creative destruction. That you may have an economy that's more technical and globalized, and you may lose certain jobs, but on the whole, the economy will be better. And the idea is easy to understand. For example, if you understand the invention of the car, for example, with Henry Ford, let's say, popularizing the Model T, horses were no longer that important. So people who bred horses, people who trained horses, they were not as important. And if they starved and died, then nobody really cared. Or they could become mechanics, or they could become drivers, or they could become car washers, but they couldn't raise horses anymore. And yet we see that there's no way out for somebody who needed a blue-collar job. And I just want to point out specifically, even though that I read this other book, again, helping somebody with a sociology paper, where the black community in Detroit, the book was called Streetwise, had a generation of what they called old heads, and they were people who were your neighbors and people who lived down the street, and if they saw you doing something inappropriate, let's say, flirting inappropriately or drinking inappropriately, they would not only tell your parents, but they would whip you on the spot, even though they weren't your parents. And one of these old heads, he talked about how he gave a kid $20 to go to the Navy recruitment center in another city. And he said, I don't even care if the kid doesn't give me the $20 back. If he makes something of himself, I'll be happy for him. So you had a lot of cohesion in the community, when you had a Ford Motor plant running really well. And that allowed a thriving black middle class and less social problems than what we see in later decades, specifically the 80s, but maybe even today. So the loss of a blue-collar job and blue-collar industry, you can't just say creative destruction because you're not understanding the real-life suffering of people, but then you're also not understanding the destruction it did to social cohesion in the black community and America at large. And there's two concepts that capitalism is closely intertwined upon, and again, they don't apply today in such a mass society. So one is rugged individualism, and that's the idea of Paul Bunyan, a lumberjack, who is able to live off the land and simply forage, and nobody lives like that today. Food comes from a grocery store. It does not come from a live animal, and in the wild nonetheless. And the other idea is the Protestant work ethic. And I remember seeing an article on the USDA website for the food stamps program, and they were saying their ideal client for food stamps would be from the painting American Gothic. And they pointed out that they're in their Sunday clothes, and yet they have their pitchfork. So people who are the salt of the earth, and they work 7 days a week, and they still need help feeding their children, that's who should be getting food stamps. But I thought that was an absurd concept, because farmers don't need help feeding their children. They literally produce food. So again, the Protestant work ethic, the entire idea of Calvinism, where if you're rich and you're beautiful and you're a believing Christian, Protestant specifically, and well, that must be because God made you that way and you're destined to go to heaven. And if you're not, and you're poor specifically, then it must be because God made you wretched. So this kind of idea was present in America from day one, because the Puritans believed in this. But I'm just learning, actually, there were early people called Unitarian Universalists who very early on, even in the Great Awakening, rejected these ideas of rejecting poor people as somehow damned by God. But this ethos is in capitalism, and specifically the American idea of capitalism. And it's completely inappropriate for our time, and yet both of these ideas are still vestiges of our political discourse. And I would also point out, for example, this idea of a mass society and being a cog in a machine, that a lot of times when you try to join, I had a brother-in-law in India who was showing me massive multiplayer online game in which you raid other people's cities and medieval towns and stuff. And usually it works out that there's only 2 clans within the MMO, the multiplayer game, and you have no chance of actually becoming a major clan or defeating them. So you may as well join one of them or join a lesser clan, but just know that your chance of getting to the top is not very wide. And on a more realistic metaphor, though, your chance of winning an election if you've never run for office before is only a few percent. And then, of course, incumbents have a lot of privileges when they're elected, power being the ultimate aphrodisiac, so people will naturally gravitate to you and assume you can give them favors. So individuals really don't matter whether you're playing video games online or whether you're trying to enter politics between the Democratic and Republican parties in real life, and you somehow don't agree with everything that both of those parties stand for. And I remember I was arguing with he was looking for an argument with a group of people I was with. So I was arguing with a hedge fund guy once, and he gave me the old Ayn Rand canard that imagine if we started taking eyes from people that are blind and giving them. Ayn Rand mentions this argument in one of her nonfiction works, where the socialist redistribution of income isn't fair any more than you could take an eye from everybody who has 2 eyes and give them to someone who's blind on the basis that, well, they have no eyes, so you should simply give them one. And so I had a hedge fund guy arguing with me once, giving me the same argument, saying, imagine in sports, if you took some points from the team that totally lost, and you gave them to the team that totally won, and then you tried to make it a more even thing so they wouldn't feel as bad. How absurd would that be? And I pointed out, actually, you do have that in sports. And he asked me, you do have that in sports? And I pointed out to him that in baseball, you have the Yankees, and they have more money than the GDP of many small countries. So literally, every time you have a good baseball player, they will buy that player, and they will not really face too much competition from Japan or any other city or state. And that's why baseball is kind of not a fun game anymore. I read in this hilarious tweet channel, Goldman Sachs Elevator, where baseball was invented when there was nothing to do but hit a ball around with your friends. So in this day of more action-packed forms of entertainment, baseball was the first to decline. Of course, NFL is also declining for its own reasons. Let's not go there. But that's a more recent trend. But baseball's decline has been more evident for that reason, and that it's a much slower sport. But also, you already know which team is probably going to enter the World Series. I can tell you one. And then you also know which teams aren't. Whereas the NFL in football is much more interesting. And the reason is because they have team caps. Whereas if you're going to get the $1 million quarterback, then you can't get the $1 million running back. And so that allows a much more even balance. And football is much more interesting. You don't know which team will go to the Super Bowl. You can guess, but there's no guarantee. And you also don't know who's going to win because who can come from behind and such. So actually, when you redistribute the chances and make it a little even playing field, even in sports, it's actually a more fun game and more enjoyable for everyone. And it's more sustainable. And for so many people, it's hard to even think outside of the realm of capitalism. My favorite philosopher, Michel Foucault, who's a French postmodernist, was often asked about formulating a post-capitalist kind of political system. And he admitted, though, it was very difficult because, quote, we have not yet cut off the head of the king. So, but I feel like Republicans and right-wing economists feel like they have such a monopoly on truth, where everything they believe is true, and a free market governs best, and low taxes are best, and a welfare state should be as minimal as possible, otherwise you're encouraging laziness, and so on and so on and so on. It's like impossible almost, certainly for mainstream news, which claims to be objective. So you don't see stories about desperate poverty in the United States. You don't see stories about hunger in the United States. You don't see stories about women forced into desperate situations and following them up, and remedies in society and such in the United States. You have maybe a news story, maybe like a happy story where a church gets involved or somebody gets involved. But looking at these things like epidemics or social ills or constant underpinnings or undesirable elements of society, that is really not the subject. So what I find is Harper's Magazine does a wonderful job. Not Harper's Bazaar, that's a fashion thing, but Harper's Magazine is a literary thing. They have great fiction, but also nonfiction. It's only $40 a year, and it's also digital. But they have every issue. And I once asked a writer who I met on the subway at Harper's, is it postmodernist? And he wouldn't agree to that. But Harper's technically never tells you who to vote for. And I feel like they saw Trump coming, but it's very, somebody once said that its politics are right out of 1968. So if you want like a heavy intellectual far left, if those are your limited ways of understanding the world, if you would call it that, far left discourse, yeah, they are unabashedly, and they're not even telling you who to vote for. They're not telling you whether to be liberal or leftist or communist or socialist or Democrat. They're just telling you all the weaknesses in capitalism. And I feel like every issue does that, and I will be a subscriber until the day that I breathe last. So I'm going to summarize a bunch of Harper's Magazine articles about deconstructing capitalism. And one of the most shocking that I read recently was about mental health in Africa. And there was a girl who had schizophrenia, and it runs in the family, as you know. So her aunt had schizophrenia, and she died a vagrant outcast. And the only solution, because they don't have enough space for mental health hospitals in the country she was in, Ghana, I believe, was to take her to a Christian-funded spiritual retreat camp where they often chain the patients to a tree. And as bad as it is, it's actually the best place for them to be because it's too much to care for them in the city. The mother can't afford to work and take care of a schizophrenic child, and the other one shows signs of schizophrenia, and another one shows signs of schizophrenia. So when you don't have adequate government hospitals in place, and I live in New York State, and it's very interesting because the New York State Constitution guarantees mental health to every person. So they've built mental health hospitals all across the state. So it's an ideal. We have not achieved it. But one of the saddest things was that they said that NGOs in the United States, they would not invest in Christian organizations because of their terrible human rights record of chaining children to trees and such. But they could easily build a well, they could easily build a toilet there, and because of that, they don't even have access to water or sanitation. And it's so broken, the NGO system. Your entire idea of foreign aid, let's not go there. But it just also shows the importance of mental health and making sure that the country has hospitals and systems to detect people who might be a danger, as we've seen the rampage of mass shootings by young Americans. Another wonderful article, this is actually by the guy who I met on the subway. I was astounded to meet him, but it's about the prison industrial complex. That's actually a term coined by The Nation. They originally ran a very long piece in the 90s about how it's profitable to ship minority kids from downstate to prisons upstate in towns that have union jobs. Even in California, for example, the prison guards union is one of the most powerful unions. So these things means jobs. So it's very lucrative actually to criminalize young black men specifically. And suburbia is built upon this facade of locking up young men of color. But I'll have to go into that another time. Another wonderful Harper's article was about Obamacare and how it was really a Republican plan hatched by Mitt Romney. But one thing that, and Trump recently pointed this out, but Obamacare gave hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies to pharmaceutical companies, and that raised their stock by 200%, 400%. So they have never been better to have like hundreds of millions of dollars of additional subsidies in your back. It means your industry is not going anywhere. It's very profitable as it was. So the other thing Obamacare does, though, not only was it hatched by the same people who did Mitt Romney's plan in Massachusetts, who is a Republican, by the way, if you don't know, it also makes consumers out of everyone. So ironically, by giving an individual mandate, something that candidate Obama said he was against, you would be giving tens of millions of new customers to the insurance companies. So that's why they signed on to Obamacare very easily. Another great article was about fast food, and I love most about, remember how we talked about film noir and how modernity is kind of bleak for the individual soul? So this article on fast food describes a stretch of the highway populated with nothing but a few fast food joints underneath the underpass, and just describes the garbage and the smell of grease and the disgusting dumpster outside in the parking lot and the cars passing through and the noise. It is the disgusting thing, and as far as the environment is, it's just a blight on the environment. But most importantly, though, it talked about how the restaurant industry, the fast food chain, is really a food production system, and it's not really a restaurant. And therefore, its workers are just part of that production system. So paying them as little as you can get away with is exactly how the food got to you. So again, these are all very powerful critiques of capitalism. You really can't get it anywhere else. But that is commercial food for you. And ironically, if you have been following the new Michael Wolff book against the Trump administration, it says Trump loves McDonald's because he has a fear of being poisoned and it's pre-packaged and they don't know he's coming. But the real article of Harper's which is the most devastating argument against capitalism, is the article on Iowa. And it talks about how everybody goes there for this or that political event. But when you really look at the state, it's not what it appears to be. First of all, it's not as white as people imagine it to be. There's a thriving Hispanic population there now, and they live amongst themselves, and they're needed obviously for the agricultural work. But because of all that agriculture, this is the shocking part, they put all these nitrogen fertilizers. Fertilizer is basically just nitrogen, by the way. So they put all these nitrogen fertilizers in the soil, and then when the rain and the other irrigation creates runoff, all that nitrogen is carried through the water, if not going into the groundwater. So basically all the water then becomes soaked with levels of nitrogen that are simply completely unnatural, and then that runs into the Mississippi River, and then it all flows down and it goes into the Gulf of Mexico, and it creates a dead zone. Because of the incredibly unnaturally high nitrogen levels, all the fish and all the coral die. And that is the ecological devastation that is going on in Iowa. I really love Harper's Magazine. I highly recommend anybody subscribe. I'll even loan you an issue of mine. But I feel like the largest point that I have in my critique of capitalism is that I have no problem if people say that they believe in the free market or that they are a libertarian or such. But then in the next sentence, if you tell me that if you believe in Jesus Christ, I have to stop you and I have to object because you have just manifestly contradicted yourself. There is no reason why Republican and laissez-faire libertarian should go together. Most probably because of verses in the New Testament like, "Those of you who have given unto the least among you have given unto me. Blessed are the poor, for they shall inherit the earth. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to go to heaven." And for Jews, they recite every Yom Kippur during the Haftorah, the verse of Isaiah where religion is to take the poor into your home and to clothe the naked and to feed the hungry. So really it's telling you you should have a homeless person in your house eating dinner at least once a year. And how many times do we do that? And finally, the Quran emphasizes in its shortest verses that you should really think, woe to those who pray and imagine themselves pious, but they turn away the needy, the one who has nothing. But people just emphasize that they want their children to pray. They don't emphasize that their children should give charity and learn to be charitable towards others. I mentioned in my second video on Salafism that there's a march of capitalism, and if we just have a McDonald's in every country, that may not be a good thing because of the garbage. Even if supposedly there's this political science theory that countries with McDonald's don't go to war with other countries that have McDonald's. But I was listening in a ironically Salafist lecture that Thomas Friedman points out that McDonnell Douglas was that fighter plane making company, the one which laid off all its workers, and then now they're working at Walmart. US foreign policy basically consists of, if you don't allow McDonald's, the fast food chain, into your country, we will send McDonnell Douglas, the fighter plane company, into that country. So again, the sociologist Mills, he said that the consolidation of power, but capitalism is also that there's a consolidation of money. There's so much excess capital that it simply swirls and becomes a power into its own right. But money has no soul. And as humans, we have a higher awareness. And our greatest teachers tell us to take care of the poor and the weakest among us. So therefore, it's dangerous to confuse religion and free market economics. You're lying to people. Capitalism is arguably the fastest way to accelerate the economy, but business passes external costs. Pollution in the river or air or groundwater. It passes these external costs to the public. Workers, for example, use public roads and buses and transportation. So there's a lie in this economic model of external costs. There is no such thing as an external cost. And I feel like that was the ultimate purpose of the film WALL-E. So you can't continue to destroy the earth and continue to simply veg out in television and entertainment and continue to pollute and assume that your life will have any quality left to it. So if the lie is that there is no such thing as an external cost, then the truth is that we are not separate from each other. And then I would propose that there's a sketch of alternative economics here. Okay, first would be that you should make sure each child has food. That way they can do well in school. Now, to help achieve full employment among college grads, maybe you can have a tutor for each child as a college grad, 6 to 10 hours a week. But then once that child does well in school, they have a stable environment, if nothing else, a fridge full at home. Then, once they do well in school, you can assign them vocational training and then give them a remunerable job. I don't know what that word meant, And let me tell you how I discovered what it meant. I went to the Occupy protests in 2011, and there was often that poster that people had, "What is our one demand?" And it kind of amplified the movement because we're not controlled by a central leadership. So what our one demand was really more of a question rather than a statement. And people criticized us for saying that it really didn't stand for anything, which was completely inaccurate. But I had a sign, for example, on the same theme. I borrowed it from someone else, obviously. But it said, "You cannot evict an idea." And people would always ask me, "What is your idea?" And my answer would be to get corporate money out of politics. Hardly original, but that's my idea. But again, so when you ask the Occupy movement, what is our one demand? If you ask me that, I would go back to President Roosevelt's proposed 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Let me pull that up. Second Bill of Rights, according to Wikipedia. And that the first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution were political rights, but now in this modern day, they proved inadequate to assure us equality in the pursuit of happiness. So he proposed an economic Bill of Rights. In our day, these economic truths have become accepted as self-evident. Mind you, this echoes the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. We have accepted, so to speak, a second Bill of Rights under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, regardless of station, race, or creed. Among these are the right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines of the nation, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation, the right of every farmer to raise and sell his products at a return which will give him and his family a decent living, the right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home or abroad, the right of every family to have a decent home, the right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health, the right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment, the right to a good education. All of these rights spell security. After this war is won, we must be prepared to move forward in the implementation of these rights to new goals of human happiness and well-being. America's own rightful place in the world depends in large part upon how fully these and similar rights have been carried into practice for all our citizens. For unless there is security here at home, there cannot be a lasting peace in the world. Well, he made that speech in 1944. And I would just like to close with another quote by FDR. "The Liberal Party is a party which believes that, as new conditions and problems arise, beyond the power of men and women to meet as individuals, it becomes the duty of the government itself to find new remedies with which to meet them. The Liberal Party insists that the government has the definite power to use all its power and resources to meet new social problems with new social controls, to ensure to the average person the right to his own economic and political life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." That theory of the role of government was expressed by Abraham Lincoln when he said, "The legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do it all, or cannot do so well for themselves in their separate and individual capacities." So I feel we will pick that up the next time because I exhausted this pretty well. But I would just say religion is against capitalism. In the USA, evangelicals are allied with Republicans, and even black churches and Southern Baptist churches ally with conservatives on so-called social issues. And Republicans are married to free market economics and their institutions. But I would just point out that Christian virtues and biblical virtues are very different than capitalist and materialist and Nietzschean virtues. They should think very long and hard about championing free market economics if you call yourself someone who believes in the Bible. If you really look at the Bible, the Old Testament has the laws of Shemitah in there, and this involves that every 7 years farmers are not allowed to pick their fields, that crop goes to the poor, and even year-round the outskirts of the field may not be picked. That is left for the poor or for beggars to travel and pick. And every 49 years in the Old Testament law, there is a complete universal forgiveness of all debts. That means bankruptcy forgiveness is guaranteed every 49 years, 7 times 7. So I have a friend who's a rabbi, and me and him agree that people are not ready for this lifestyle. But the next time you think that God, country, and capitalism go together, you should really think about what you're saying. Of course, the message of Christ was to give to the poor, sell everything. That is what happened once when a rich young man came to Jesus. He told him to sell everything, and the man couldn't do it. So your possessions keep you. You're so busy worrying about people on welfare. Maybe you have too much money. And that's not me saying that. That's not even a communist grab. But your own founder of your own religion is saying maybe you have too much money. And I remember watching this Christian preacher who was evangelical, but he points out that when Christ says to love your enemies, that's a complete reversal of the way the world works in which we live, of which, of course, you have to wage war on your enemies, if not destroy them or undermine them. And so he said, love your enemies. So I don't think the point of being a Christian is to support capitalist economics and the march of capitalism and consolidated money and consolidated power across the world. I can see why libertarianism and free market economics could be considered normal or natural, but from a religious point of view, that's Rome or the Roman Empire, in that power marches, it destroys every other culture, it subsumes everything with its incredible wealth, but we have to remain separate as believers. We can't participate in Rome, and they worship money and they worship food, and you see all of these excesses going on in our own society in which so much waste happens. Don't even get me started. And I feel Muslims should also think very hard about themselves, in that I had a relative who was encouraging a relative of mine to go get a job at a bank. And really, Muslims don't believe in interest, and banks are inherently exploitative. They take money from whoever, wherever, no questions asked. So you don't even know where you're getting your interest from. And then they probably participate in a lot of criminal laundering. So I don't think Christians should brag about being a Republican or a Democrat or voting supposedly on conservative values, because if that includes free market economics, Christ had nothing to do with that. And if it's just a political party, then Jesus was bigger than that.